Tucker. Thank you. There we go. Great. Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Big thank you to Schneider for hosting this in beautiful San Francisco. I think of San Francisco in the summer as essentially like working in a data center 10 years ago. It's a little bit cold, right? But for those of us in warm summer climates right now, it's actually a nice break. So I'm going to be talking about kind of what's next for the colocation business and trying to set the stage, I think, for the rest of our discussions today and at DCD tomorrow. So a few sort of buzzwords will come up. I think being an analyst, we can't go an hour these days without talking about edge and IoT. So it's kind of, you can get your buzzword bingo cards out. I'll definitely talk about a few of those, but mainly kind of thinking about where colocation as a market is headed and some of the ways that colocation providers can differentiate as things change. So I am head of the data center business at 451 Research. 451 Research is an analyst firm that covers new technology and change. I like this quote because it's kind of describes the way I feel about my day sometimes, that things are changing ever more rapidly. And at 451 Research, we study technology and particularly new technologies going forward. On the data center team, there are actually 10 of us devoted just to covering data centers. We spend our time roaming the world, essentially visiting sites. Some of you will recognize us, I'm sure. And in addition to our own tours and interviews with people to really understand city by city, actually around the world, what's happening in this market, we also do a lot of surveys. So we have about 60,000 enterprises that have signed up to take surveys with us. And we do quarterly surveys. We try to get about 1,000 respondents around the world to each one. And we ask all kinds of questions about security, cloud, expenditures, where people think things are headed, IoT, that sort of thing. So I'm going to use a lot of graphs and charts that give those results. And I think you'll get all these presentations afterwards. So if some of them are kind of small, don't worry. You'll be able to see them later. And we also, I'll talk a little bit about this, but we've also just recently, in the past year, started surveying separately around 250 cloud managed service and system integrators, so also your customers, and asking them about their plans for expansion and how they're seeing things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where the industry's come from, kind of how it's changed over the past few years, and then where we're headed, some potential technology changes, things like that, and then some takeaways for the day. So where we've come from, first eye chart. So data centers overall have been growing about 5%. That's because that big dark line at the bottom, that's enterprise-owned data centers. So that's been pretty stable. I mean, some folks would think of them as shrinking. When we ask enterprises, interestingly, they tell us they're still building these things. Often either as a result of consolidating, so they're building them but also shutting others down, or expansion around the world, and we may start to see a little bit more movement there, depending on IoT and what happens with the edge. In the middle, which is a little hard to see, but growing at about 11%, has been the leased data center industry. We call them multi-tenant data centers, or MTDC, but we actually include single tenants, some of them in there. They're essentially leased, so colocation and wholesale. And the sort of faint line at the top growing by 21% are the hyperscale cloud-owned data centers. So we'll talk a minute about how that's been shifting, and a lot of the cloud providers have been leasing a lot more, but they're certainly still building in large chunks. Actually, and these are the growth rates from 2013 to 2018, and going forward, they're pretty similar. So we'll talk about that. Over the past 5 years, same amount of time, it's a little hard to read here, but it gives you a sense. These are the ones that are growing. So Northern Virginia is the largest market in the world. I like to compare it by explaining that all of the data center space in Canada fits into half of the amount that's in Northern Virginia. That's how big Northern Virginia is. Massive, massive market, but it's a little bit lower on here just in terms of growth. It's growing at about 15% a year. Huge growth from very particular markets like Las Vegas. That's been growing at about 30% a year. Montreal is right up there, and that one's due to continue. We're seeing a lot of big expansion there, but from a relatively small base. Then we'll have a lot of Chinese markets. I did not put them all in here, but Shenzhen is up there at 24%, and we've had, I think Beijing is at about 10, Shanghai is growing at about 15, so lots of growth coming there. Moving on down the line, you can see lots. I think what's interesting, though, is that somewhere like New York, which is down here, or Boston, right? Those are big cities. They are top 10 markets, but they've been growing much more slowly than, say, Northern Virginia or Montreal, and that's due to cloud, and that's because the customers have changed. So I've been covering this industry really actually since about 2007, at 451 since about 2010. And for my first almost 10 years, we were really focused on enterprises, and they were the ones doing a lot of, especially wholesale leasing, and they were responsible for making New York, New Jersey one of the top 10 markets. You had financial firms moving stuff out into colo. You had lots of big enterprises putting things. Of course, that has dramatically changed. So on this left-hand side, in 2013, that was the demand from cloud providers, particularly kind of top 10. And this has been the demand in 2018. So Canada, there was basically nothing from cloud providers in 2030. You had a few pops. Now lots of wholesale demand. Elsewhere in Europe, I didn't get the Asia stuff on here, but that's in some cases even more dramatic. In China with BAT, they're responsible for really the bulk of it. So the customer base has dramatically changed, at least for wholesale providers, and it's had a big impact on the market purely because of the vast amounts of space and power required. So, kind of the unsung, quieter movement has been continued sort of steady growth for the smaller rack-by-rack customers. Some of them have changed too. You have fewer SMBs, a lot more kind of interconnect-oriented single-rack type deployments. But the market is talking about, investors are really wild about this big cloud growth and what's happening there. And that will definitely continue. The question is where, right? Some of it's going to adjust to some other locations. Okay. So we'll talk about where in a little bit more, but I wanted to talk, these are the things I decided to bring up in terms of where we're headed that could kind of influence what's happening and some of the ways that we can make money on these going forward. So hybrid cloud, we'll keep talking about cloud growth, as I was saying. AI and what that's going to do. IoT, got to bring up some IoT and edge stuff. And then just a quick word on environmental changes and what kind of opportunities those can bring as well as challenges. So cloud, we've seen that huge cloud demand. And I think the thing to keep in mind, this is kind of a complicated, difficult chart to see from a distance, but the top bit up here is public cloud. So these are firms that have the majority of their workloads in public cloud. That little tiny bit at the top is actually what we think of as cloud, so Amazon, Microsoft, Google, infrastructure as a service. Second there would be software as a service, so that's the SAPs and those kind of folks. Then this whole section here is actually private cloud, and then down here is kind of the traditional stuff. So I think the key thing to point out is that even though cloud is making a lot of news and cloud providers are taking huge amounts of space and growing like crazy, it's still early days. We still have a lot of enterprises that don't even have things in cloud yet. I was just actually looking at numbers for Europe the other day, and on average across Europe, around 20% of enterprises have anything in cloud at all. Right? So there's still a huge amount of potential growth out there for cloud providers. They've certainly, they're seeing this. I think they're constantly striving and having challenges keeping their infrastructure up to date to deal with the growing demand. But there's still plenty of room for additional growth. So from a colo perspective, we're still going. And on the private cloud side, that is expected to grow, and we'll talk in a minute about hybrid and kind of what enterprises are seeing going forward. Now, when we ask cloud and service providers where they're growing, and this one's going to be a little tough to see too, but the bigger blue here, that's where folks already have deployments. The slightly sort of bluish orange is where they're planning on expanding, and then there's some like pure orange down here where they're going into totally new markets. So this gives you a sense. I mean, North America, really big, UK, really big, but a lot of potential growth to come from APAC. We've got Mexico, actually, with some brand new things. We've got Latin America. So there are a lot of locations that cloud and managed service providers, are still thinking of expanding to. And what's interesting there, you do start to hear, I know, we're following folks around getting a lot of demand for locations where the big public cloud providers are not yet, but are moving into. So I was looking, for example, at Milan, where a big cloud location is opening. We've got South Africa. And the big cloud providers, of course, move to these locations, but then often are followed by a lot of managed service providers, systems integrators, all kinds of other folks. And in some respects, they're the ones that will really drive a lot of your business. So even if you do not get the mega wholesale deployment with Amazon, anybody kind of in the neighborhood could get a lot of additional business just from the firms that tend to follow along. They tend to come like about 2 years later. So sometimes you may have to hold out there a little bit, but lots of potential demand coming still. Now, when we ask enterprises about cloud, I think back in the early days, you had a lot of the cloud providers kind of envisioning everything going to their cloud. Amazon used to say this. Everything was going to come to Amazon. Enterprises now have, decided going forward, hybrid is the way it's going to be. They're using multiple clouds. They're mixing and matching on-prem, off-prem, private cloud, hosted infrastructure in various places with public cloud. So I think all of you have seen this, and it's been a big driver, and it will continue to be a huge driver for colocation going forward. Because any of that hybrid kind of mixture, it makes a big difference. It's really helpful for enterprises. They don't necessarily realize this yet. I think they're still getting there. But to be in a colocation location where they can connect directly to multiple cloud providers and to, say, hosted private cloud options, that's going to be the way forward. This also, in addition to kind of just being in the right colocation location, there's a lot of demand, and we'll see this in a minute, for managed services around that, what I think of as cloud wrappers. Hybrid is a nightmare. It's complex. It's really difficult to do well. And we hear from most enterprises that they would love help with this. It's challenging for them to figure out what should go where and how to make these pieces work together and get the best both security and efficiency from them. For those who offer managed services, and also as another benefit to getting service providers into your data center, we have a whole unit, the guy with a PhD in cloud pricing, who work on the economics of public cloud, and they've been doing a lot of comparisons with private cloud. And interestingly, he's found that private cloud can actually be cheaper than Amazon and public cloud as long as it's kind of well utilized. So, and I think a lot of enterprises are discovering this and talking about this. If you have, steady state workloads and very high utilization that's consistent, then it's going to be cheaper for you to either have it in-house or in a colo or in a private cloud. And also if it's to a certain degree automated. The more automation, the better. And that's where service providers can really help. A lot of enterprises don't want to build this all from scratch. They don't want to deal with having a lot of staff running around managing their IT servers, and so there's a big opportunity here for cloud and colo providers that can offer packages that make this cheaper and more efficient. So on to the managed services. When we ask folks what services they use, backup, disaster recovery, everyone hates it. It's a pain to do. It's hard to do well. It's expensive. So that's still our most popular service out there when we hear from people. But also up there, it's a little hard to see these, but day-to-day management of cloud stuff. operational monitoring, making sure it's all working, making sure things work together, managing applications that are deployed and determining kind of how well they're working, especially latency-wise. That's all tough to do, and it's something people love help with. Security tends to come up here as well. I don't think we asked too specifically about it here, but that's another popular service. So lots of potential. The key thing here is that enterprises now want kind of packages. They want complete services, not just products, right? So you do still have people selling individual firewalls. What enterprises want is they want the whole thing to just work. They want to feel comfortable, they want to be secure, they want to know it's working, and they don't want to necessarily have to put together all these different pieces. We ask there's still a few, tends to be the larger enterprises who have big IT teams who like to do best of breed and unify it all themselves. But most of the smaller, medium-sized firms, they want help putting all this together. So they want complete solutions, not just individual products. And they're willing to pay more for it. We definitely hear that as well. They're willing to pay money for this stuff, and it's helpful for them to have. So what does all this mean? There will continue to be cloud demand, cloud growth. They'll still make a lot of headlines. They're going to push out into a lot of new locations. We have seen cloud providers, we could have another whole discussion about needing to go into more kind of GDP-dense, population-dense locations. Up until now, a lot of the major cloud sites have been in cheap, distant locations. But we'll discuss this a little bit more when we get to AI. When it comes to the new types of workloads being deployed on cloud, the latency becomes an issue. And so they're starting to look at deploying much closer into population centers and therefore needing to lease because it can be a little bit challenging to get a big site in New York or in London or in Tokyo. You need to be with a colocation provider who's already there. So lots happening there. Then keeping in mind those secondary IT firms that follow them also will be going all around the world and to these larger cities. And then hybrid, lots of interest there in being in the right location. That'll drive a lot of additional business in managed services and interconnection. And then continued demand for these cloud wrappers. So I think one more thing to say about that is there is a sort of I think of it as a rush to a race, really, to see who can be that trusted advisor for the end customer. Colocation providers are definitely in the running. You have systems integrators, you have ISVs, you have a whole bunch of people competing for that business. I think colocation providers can do well there because they've already got things working, like you're making stuff. People already often have deployments with you, they trust you, they know that you've kept things up and running. But we're seeing a lot of colocation providers partnering more with the ISVs and the managed service providers out there as well as sort of a hedge. You can kind of get both benefits. In some cases, as the colo provider, you can do some of the basic services, especially disaster recovery and backup makes a lot of sense, and partner with other firms to do the more advanced kind of cloud wrapper management stuff. So there are a lot of options there and ways to make money, basically. So on to AI and machine learning. So the key thing here in our surveys, which I think surprised us, is that almost 50% of the companies that we've asked in surveys either are deploying AI or machine learning software, or they're planning to in the next year. We had another batch that are going to deploy in 2 years. So this is here. A lot of companies are interested. We're getting a lot of requests and inquiries about how to do a lot now. So even for regular workloads, we will probably start to see a lot more pressure on kind of density rising in data centers going forward. So this is relatively kind of new. I think Intel has held back on boosting the density of their chips dramatically, but they're starting to go forward here. When we ask enterprises, how much is their average, it's still there in that 5 kilowatts per rack kind of range, 3 to 5 even. So it hasn't changed much in 10 years, average. But when we ask them what's the highest density rack they have, how many of these high density racks, What's interesting is that this wedge right here, that's 30 kW per rack and above. So you have a lot of folks out there with more than 30 kW racks. I mean, that is dramatic. We didn't see any of those 5 years ago even. You do still have, this is the batch where the highest ones are below 10 kW, but right here, this big wedge is 10 to 20 kW per rack. And that's where all the cloud providers are at a minimum, and a lot of the managed service providers who are your customers. So overall, this is getting to be a big, big deal. And for data center providers, for colo folks, it's a nightmare, right? Because folks will come in and say, well, I have all this stuff that's 5, and then I have this one room where I need it to be 40. It's difficult to prepare for, and it's difficult to build a data center for. So that's going to keep being a challenge. I think one of the key things actually there is that it changes the economics and the incentives around liquid cooling. So I think we may talk about this a little bit later today, but I think we've got a couple of things in the mix that could be driving a lot more interest in liquid cooling going forward. I mean, number one, I think folks are becoming very innovative and coming up with form factors that are a little more, how would I say, similar to the way people are used to working. The economics are coming down to where it makes sense, to use liquid cooling. And I think people are coming up with ways to make it easier to install liquid cooling options without having to totally change your data center. So those of you that, have built sites that in the past you didn't think it would be an option to get past a certain amount of density, you may have more options going forward. So we're going to see a lot of kind of interesting new developments there. So what this means, density may finally start really rising. More applications are going to require high-density racks. There's an opportunity to partner with AI firms. They do have challenges recommending to their customers where to go. This is another big driver for getting people out of their enterprise data centers, which are getting pretty old and creaky and not able to deal with 40 kilowatt racks. So there's a lot of potential kind of demand coming forward from where we're at with AI. And it's real. It's here today. IoT, also surprisingly real. So everyone I think that we talk to thinks of IoT as either, Nest at your home, DSIM in your data center, or self-driving cars, right? But a lot of this is happening. When we ask surveys, when we ask in our surveys whether people have IoT deployments, surprisingly, 71%. And that's been pretty steady over the past year. It's been anywhere from 70 to 75% have either IoT or plans to install it in the next year. And we're starting to see the impacts on their infrastructure. So around a third of the folks in our last survey said they were having to add storage capacity in the next 12 months to deal with this IoT data. We've actually had some interesting results where folks had said around 80% of their IoT data is currently on-prem. So most enterprises are dealing with their data right now. They're storing it on-prem or on the device or somewhere close by. But in about 2 years, that was going to flip to where 80% were hoping to put the majority of the IoT data in the cloud. And there's a lot of implications there around, that could be wishful thinking. How much money is it going to cost? How are you going to get it all there? There's a lot of network implications. And also, do the cloud providers even have that in their models? We've got all this movement still of regular workloads and software as a service and other types of things moving to cloud. If you're also talking about a tidal wave of IoT data coming, that could have a lot of implications for where data center space is going to be needed to house all that. So far, around 10% plan to add storage and colocation, just specifically for IoT data. But also, they're planning to do some edge work. When we ask sort of generally about networking, we're just starting to see edge and IoT workloads impacting kind of network and how people deal with that. So that's going to be interesting. That has just shown up in the past year in terms of people thinking about this impact on their network. And Cisco has talked about this. There's visions of a lot of IoT data kind of taking over network traffic. I think the key thing here is the sort of push-pull between network and data center space. And to a certain degree, a lot of that sort of who's going to win and where these things are going to go and how much will be determined by business models and kind of innovation around business models and pricing. So on the one hand, if network keeps getting cheaper and you've got a ton of capacity, then it may make sense to just move all that traffic to some centralized cloud location, right? If you're in an area, like me in Boston, where I can't get Netflix at my house, if you're in an area without a lot of network capacity or where it's quite expensive, then it'll make maybe more sense to put everything in a data center that's localized. So I think you'll also have some of the economics behind it. It may be cheaper to have a little localized data center somewhere than to spend on the network capacity. So depending on whether we get innovations around the business models for putting small data centers out there, micromodular, different ways to pay for those, versus innovation coming from telcos and how they charge you for that capacity, especially out at the edge, they've not been real willing to be super innovative around pricing models up until now. Maybe that'll change, but so we're going to see a lot of kind of interesting, I would say, dynamics between those around, who's going to be more innovative and how that will impact where people store and process this data. So far, as a result, enterprises are trying to limit the amount that they're sending around by analyzing it more and more at the edge, which makes sense, right? You get all this data, you try to sift through it and figure out what you need to store somewhere central, and then you divide it up and only move around what really needs to move. The super interesting thing there, I think, from the Colo perspective, is that if you're analyzing this stuff and doing more advanced artificial intelligence processing at the edge, that's going to lead to a different demand for data center space out at the edge as well. So you're going to need data center space in small buckets, small micro data centers that can deal with AI, that can deal with high density, that can store this very important data and do this very important number crunching in small boxes in a redundant way, without dying. You're going to need security around these things because this is very important data out being crunched at the edge. So a lot of that has not, in some ways, even been invented yet. I mean, these are not the typical telco pops that a lot of people are thinking will sort of deal with edge demand. These are, advanced data centers that have to be out there in their millions at the edge, number crunching this data. So there should be a lot of demand going forward for some of these really interesting kind of new options. And we're just sort of waiting to see, who's going to come up with kind of the most interesting ways to address this. There's going to be a need. So lots of stuff going there. I do like to just talk about what we think of as the edge. This will be quick. For me, the edge is really kind of where the data is produced. We kind of also at 451 define it by kind of however people define it, because everyone has a different sense of where their edge is, but pretty much it's kind of where the data is coming from. In between, we have what we're thinking of as kind of this near edge or semi-edge, and that's where a lot of the interconnect hubs will be. It's where you've got a lot of demand for kind of initial processing. And then we'll have core, which is a lot of these hyperscale or enterprise data centers where stuff kind of goes to sit and be archived. So that's what we're talking about. So all of this means, we'll need some additional cloud space, which we're not even sure the cloud providers have totally factored into their models. A lot of innovation to come, I think. We need that actually at the edge. There's going to be a lot of demand for it. And we're going to need either more network capacity or, edge, more data centers out there. And a lot of that could even vary by city. Certain cities are going to have a lot of cheap network. That'll be fine. Other locations, you'll need more data center space. So finally, last kind of quick word, I guess, on environmental changes and what that could mean. We've been tracking this. I think the main point here is the unpredictability of it, right? Certain areas are getting hotter, have gotten hotter. Certain areas are getting colder. You've got floods and flood zones being redefined in some areas, other things happening. I think in general, the main kind of takeaway for colo providers is that as you get more unpredictability, enterprise interest in outsourcing this risk goes up. So we've seen after big events, Hurricane Sandy that hit New York was a big example of a huge interest in outsourcing to colo providers elsewhere, but even within New York, after these kind of events. So lots of potential demand there, I think, to come, lots of ways for colo providers to kind of explain, this is our benefit, we're taking a lot of this risk on ourselves, we've planned our data centers accordingly. You can make a lot of kind of risk reduction sort of steps by using our data centers and our disaster recovery and backup type approaches. So, lots of potential there. Now, of course, the impacts, I do know data centers that are sitting in what did not used to be flood zones that are now flood zones. So, there are definitely challenges to that as well. We've talked to providers who've had to rethink, in particular, the staffing of the data center. I think a lot, post-Hurricane Sandy, for example, several of the colo providers, in addition to realizing they had better put in submersible pumps, right, because you had people carrying diesel up hundreds of flights of stairs in New York City to the generators that were on the roof, but also a lot more effort and thought put into staffing your data center. This gets us back to the AI potential for staffing, but having to figure out where your staff are going to be, they're going to want to be with their families. We know of providers who will bring in staff from elsewhere in the country if something's coming, so that their staff in Miami or in Houston or wherever can go, take care of their families. We've also talked to a firm that was in, I think they had data centers in Miami when a hurricane was coming, and they were forced to evacuate. I mean, everyone had to leave the data center. So they had to just leave it there and hope it would keep itself running. So there's definitely some interest in, AI, DSIM options, things you can do to monitor your data center if all your staff are forced to leave. That one actually worked out well and it kept itself going, but it's something that could happen. So fires, again, we've also seen a lot of these, especially out in the West. So you want to be thinking about your cooling options, and there again, liquid cooling could start to be kind of interesting just in the sense of not having potential smoke coming into your data center. There's a lot of different things to think about that I think firms setting up, say, in Silicon Valley didn't necessarily think about years ago. So all of that to say, let's see, there we go. Continued demand for renewables actually is another thing too. So we are hearing about a lot more enterprises besides just the top kind of 10 that have been pursued by Greenpeace, but a lot of interest from customers now in renewables and purchasing power agreements that we have in the US in terms of at least purchasing or offsetting with renewable energy, the energy that the data center is using. Every now and then you do have data centers kind of hitting the radar as using huge amounts of power, and we're going to see a lot more of that, I think, in countries where data centers have not been so obvious up until now. The US has already kind of dealt with several rounds of journalism writing about how much power these places use and the problems that they can cause, but we'll see a lot more of that in countries that haven't had to deal with this so far. So you might want to get your PR story ready about how efficient most of these data centers are, especially compared to a lot of the old enterprise ones out there. But so still, lots going on in that sense. Electricity and cooling could grow more expensive, of course. Some of this cost gets passed on to customers, but a lot of it does still encourage data center operators to continue to be more efficient. So another way to advertise that you're often more efficient than enterprise data centers, but that will keep going. The pressure there is not going to change. I know here in the US, in certain locations where you've got sort of the power supply shifting, you've got power plants coming offline because they're coal-fired, for example. So, we are starting to see some price increases in locations where price has been not an issue, and a lot of firms have built really big data centers because the power price was low. Some of that could change. So, we're certainly monitoring that, and I think you're going to see some interesting trends there going forward. Increased flood risk, we already talked about, and then continued interest in disaster recovery, as we saw before. I think, again, one of these things that a lot of the enterprises focus on with cloud is you kind of put stuff in cloud and think that it's fine, right? And that you don't necessarily have to do disaster recovery because in the cloud it's automatic, when of course it's not. A lot of people have discovered Amazon goes down just as well as other firms, and that you kind of have to set up your own backup to make sure things are still going to run. So again, that's an opportunity, I think, for managed service providers to get out there and say, look, we have all these unexpected things. Amazon could go down. You want to have us help you determine your best disaster recovery strategy and backup plan as well. So overall takeaways. Demand, certainly for colocation, is going to stay strong. I mean, we have actually the market growing from now until 2029 by high single digits, which you would think is not huge, but considering its steady, stable growth, and that hides a lot of variations by city, by country, by region. We have APAC and Latin America growing closer to 10%. Whereas Europe and the US down in that 3 to 4%. But that's partly because they're huge markets already. Northern Virginia, or actually somewhere even like, I would say Dallas, adds in terms of space in 1 year what the entire market is in Portland or some of these smaller cities. So for them to grow 6%, is a huge amount of space in Northern Virginia. In some of these smaller countries and smaller markets, there's still a lot of room for potential growth. So still to remain strong, customers seeking solutions, right? Not products. And one thing at 451 Research, we call the data centers and network, we're starting to call it invisible infrastructure, which a lot of people don't like, but it's, you guys, it's invisible infrastructure. People want it to just work. They want infrastructure that's sort of like the power system. You plug something in, you turn it on. You don't have to think about who the company is necessarily, providing that power. Firms just want this infrastructure to work. They want it to be relatively invisible, not something they have to think about every day. And that's going to kind of be a differentiator. If you can make sure that firms don't have to think about you, that's a big advantage. Innovation, still needed, certainly around, I think, cooling going forward, some of the options there, dealing with these really high-density chips, but also around the edge, both on the business model side, how to make these small deployments easy for people to pay for, or appealing, I guess, for them, figure out who's going to pay for them. But then also, kind of more broadly around power and cooling and how to be more efficient. There'll still be demand there, as well as kind of renewable energy, continued demand for that as well. Rising density, industrialization, that's the AI for data centers themselves, thinking about how to make this efficient and how to keep things operating, keep the lights on with as little trouble as possible, especially as the complexity grows for these giant facilities. And the interest in renewable energy going forward. So with that, I think that's it for me for now. I think I'll let Greg go. We've got questions at the end of this, so we can certainly have a debate, and I'll also be at the lunch. So I'm happy to talk more about any of these things.